Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's continue with chapter 4 of the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. This one having to do with part 4 of the book, once again continuing the theme associated with close encounters of the fourth kind. This is the scary stuff, the stuff involving actual alien abductions. This will actually conclude chapter 4 for this go around, and then I'll continue the next part, which will start with chapter 5. It'll be interesting to see what takes place there. But here, as always, this chapter will have some certain cases associated with close encounters of the fourth kind. Let's see if any of these are some that I've already talked about, or if there's going to be some new ones, some new stuff that looks interesting, and then we'll see if that's something that I'll mention in future videos too. So this next segment is called Death by Unnatural Causes. And so let's go ahead and let's feature that, and then I'll go ahead as always and then post my own thoughts and opinions on it too. So here's what this segment says. Zygmunt Andatsky, a 57-year-old Pole who had been a prisoner of war throughout the Nazi occupation of his country in the Second World War, settled in England after his release. Here, Adamski, no relation to the American contactee George Adamski, met his future wife Lottie, worked as a miner for many years, was well liked by his neighbors, and had no apparent enemies. On June 6, 1980, he left his home in the Tingley suburb of Leeds, West Yorkshire, to buy a bag of potatoes. He was not seen alive again. 5 days later, his body was discovered by Trevor Parker, who was loading his truck at his father's coal yard in the neighboring village of Todmorden. The body was lying on top of a coal tip. Although it had recently been raining, there were no tracks on the sides of the tip to suggest how he might have got there. At the inquest into Adamski's death, which was not held until 15 months later to give the police more time for their ultimately fruitless inquiries, it was revealed that he suffered from angina, and while his death could have been caused by heart failure resulting from exhaustion, a pathologist also said that he might have died of fright. The postmortem also revealed the presence of strange burn marks on Adamski's head and neck, apparently caused by some corrosive substance, which forensic scientists were unable to identify. According to pathologist Dr. Alan Edwards, there were scratches on the palms of both hands and the knees. The coroner, James Turnbull, recorded a verdict of death by natural causes, although he added that foul play could not be ruled out and appealed to the public for any further information. When interviewed by reporters, Trevor Parker said, "The body was just lying there in plain sight. I didn't know whether the man was dead or alive, so I called the police and an ambulance. I was very frightened. I didn't want to be out there by myself. The body gave me a very eerie feeling. I have no idea how the man got in the yard, but I know one thing for absolute certain. There was no body on that coal pile when I loaded my truck earlier in the day." Not only was the corrosive substance found on Adamski unidentified, it also appeared to have been carefully applied while the upper part of the body was naked. His face and clothes were entirely undamaged. Although his watch and wallet were missing, there was a $5 note in his pocket. The sinister connection with UFOs came as a result of a number of sightings in the area around the time of Adamski's disappearance, one of which had been made by Alan Godfrey, who had been the first police officer to arrive at the scene following Parker's call to the authorities. Godfrey later said that Adamski's face held an expression of fright or terror. He also noticed a deep 3-inch incision in the back of the neck, which contained a liquid later identified as boiled water. His hair had also been cut into a close crop. It had been a normal length when he left his house, and he was clean-shaven, which was not consistent with living rough for 5 days. His jacket was fastened incorrectly, perhaps implying that someone else had put it on him. The body had apparently been placed with some care on top of the coal tip. In the opinion of one police officer who examined it, it would have taken a helicopter to achieve this, since there was absolutely no disturbance to the loose coal. At the inquest into the death, coroner James Turnbull had this to say: "As a trained lawyer, I have to rely on facts. Unfortunately, We have not been able to uncover any facts which may have contributed to this death. I tend to believe there may be some simple explanation. However, I do admit that the failure of forensic scientists to identify the corrosive substance which caused Mr. Adamski's burns could lend some weight to the UFO theory. As a coroner, I cannot speculate, but I must admit that if I was walking over Ilking Moor tomorrow and a UFO came down, I would not be surprised. I might be terrified, but not surprised. I cannot believe that all the thousands of reports of this sort of phenomenon, all covering almost every country in the world and going back through the ages, that this all results from human error. It is quite the most mysterious death I have investigated in 12 years. A strange postscript to this tale occurred on March 1983 when Mark Birdsall of the UFO magazine received a telephone call from an individual claiming to be a relative of Zygmunt Adamski's. This individual, who has never been traced, informed Birdsall that after leaving his house, Adamski was met by a group of fellow Poles whom he knew well and who took him to a derelict hut a few miles away and imprisoned him there. He was kept there, apparently as a punishment for some unspecified transgression, until his death. He sustained the injuries to his hands and knees by clambering up a wall to a window in an attempt to escape. According to Birdsall's informant, Adamski received the strange burns by grabbing a loose shelf and dislodging a tin of acid, which hit him on the head. His captors found him and, not having intended to harm him, panicked. They cleaned him up, but he died, and then they dumped his body on the coal tip. The editors of UFO magazine wisely hold back from making any sensational statements regarding this intriguing case, preferring to let the information we have, such as it is, speak for itself. There are many unanswered questions, perhaps the most important of which is, if Adamski spilled some form of acid or other burning solution on himself, why were the pathologists unable to identify it? Also, how could Adamski's associates place his body on top of a wet, 7-foot high coal tip without leaving any trace of their activities? And why did the mysterious whistleblower contact Mark Birdsall with his information instead of the police, who would doubtless have followed up on it? Perhaps the answer is that they would have indeed followed up on it and found it to be spurious. Could it be that the true purpose of the call to a UFO-related publication was to pour cold water on any connection with UFOs? This would make the caller's true identity of even greater interest. Next segment is called Sometimes They Don't Come Back. One of the most astonishing cases of possible UFO abduction occurred on the shores of Lake Anjikuna, Canada, in the winter of 1930. The case is astonishing because it involved the disappearance of an entire Eskimo village with a population of 1,200. It began with the sighting of a strange object moving through the sky. Trapper Armand Laurent and his 2 sons were outside their cabin when they saw it. Laurent described the light as continuously changing shape as it glided overhead from a cylinder to a bullet shape. A few days after this sighting, 2 officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived at the cabin. They were on their way north from their base at Churchill to Lake Anjikuna and asked Laurent if they might shelter there for the night. According to the Mounties, there was a quote-unquote kind of problem at the lake. When Laurent mentioned the strange light he had seen, they asked him which direction it was moving in. He replied that it had been heading towards Lake Anjikuni. For Armand Laurent and his sons, that was the end of the matter. Not so, however, for another trapper named Joe LaBelle, who had snowshoed towards the Eskimo village on the shores of the lake a few days earlier. LaBelle had many friends in this village, and it was with a sense of pleasant anticipation that he made his way across the frozen landscape to spend some time with them. That anticipation gradually turned to creeping dread as he drew near. Stopping at the edge of the village, he shouted a greeting, and there was no one to be seen in the normally bustling little community, which LaBelle found hard to understand. Peering through the icy gloom towards the lake shore, he could make out a few kayaks, battered and torn by the wave action, lying on the beach. LaBelle entered the village and moved along the huts, glancing in increasing apprehension at the empty doorways. with their caribou skin flaps billowing forlornly in the icy wind. For more than an hour, he searched the village in vain for signs of its inhabitants. He discovered pots of congealed caribou stew hanging over the ashes of long-dead fires. He found sealskin garments, obviously belonging to a child, one of which had an ivory needle hanging from it. A mother must have been mending it, LaBelle surmised, when something happened to make her stop. Even more disturbing than this was the presence of the Eskimos' rifles standing abandoned by the doors of the huts. To a seasoned trapper like Joe LaBelle, this was truly astonishing. An Eskimo's rifle is the single most important possession. Not one of the villagers would have gone anywhere without it in the hostile northern vastness unless he were tired of living. And yet, gone they had without their only means of protection. LaBelle could stay no longer in that deserted place. He fled across the tundra to the nearest telegraph office and sent a report to the RCMP base in Churchill. The Mounties, dispatched to the lake, persuaded LaBelle to return with them to the village. LaBelle agreed, not least because he wanted to find out what had happened to the Eskimo sled dogs, which were nearly as important to their survival as their rifles. They found the dogs about 100 yards from the village, tethered to some stunted trees. All of them were frozen solid, having died of starvation. Mystery was compounded by mystery, and yet the greatest and most ominous puzzle was about to reveal itself. On the far side of the village, the Eskimos had previously buried a member of their community under the traditional cairn of stones. When LaBelle and the Mounties came to the grave, they found that it was empty. The stones had been placed to one side in two neat piles. The ground had been opened and the body removed. None of the investigators could understand why this had happened, or indeed how, since the ground was frozen solid. Animals were surely not to blame, since the stones had been stacked by the open grave. A major investigation was launched and a nationwide search conducted with the aid of experienced trackers, but no trace of the villagers was ever found. The only conclusion arrived at was that at some point everyone had left their homes, apparently attracted by something that was happening outside. They had left their rifles, their dogs, their food and clothing, and had not returned. Their kayaks had been left behind also, meaning that they had not set out across the lake. In the 1989 novel Majestic, American author Whitley Strieber weaves the Lake Anjikuna incident into the narrative and suggests an intriguing solution to the mystery of the empty grave. Since the Eskimos had great respect for their dead, might not their ancestor have been taken away also as a sign of respect for their beliefs? This, of course, begs the question, who took them away and why? Although Eskimos have been known to migrate suddenly from their settlements, they do not do so without the means to ensure their survival. The questions surrounding the strange episode have never been answered, and the RCMP file on the disappearance of the Lake Anjikuna community remains open to this day. Next segment is called The Hungry Sky. It was to have been an evening of celebration and joy. During Christmas Eve 1909, 5 inches of snow had fallen, covering the ground in an undisturbed carpet of white as far as the eye could see. At the Thomas farm near the town of Rhyder, Wales, a number of friends gathered for an evening of carol singing. As the evening wore on and midnight approached, they roasted chestnuts on the glowing embers of the fire and prepared to celebrate the arrival of Christmas Day. Around the hearth of Owen Thomas were his family, several close friends, the minister and his wife, the local veterinarian, and an auctioneer from one of the neighboring villages. At about 11 o'clock, Owen Thomas noticed that the water bucket was empty. In those days, rural homes relied on wells for their drinking water. Mindful of his guests, whose joyful singing would doubtless bring on a thirst, Thomas turned to his 11-year-old son Oliver and asked him to take the bucket out to the well and fill it. Oliver was a good lad, and despite the cheery warmth of the house, he was happy to put on his boots and overcoat and venture out into the icy night air. He had been gone only a few seconds when the carol singing was interrupted by his frantic cries for help. Shocked by the unexpected sounds, everyone rushed out of the house and into the snow-covered yard, which Oliver had been crossing on his way to the well only a few moments before. The minister had seized a paraffin lantern, which he now held up, casting a flickering light onto the empty yard, but Oliver had gone. His footsteps, which could clearly be seen in the 5-inch deep snow extending in a straight line in the direction of the well, suddenly stopped 75 feet away, as if something had swooped down from the sky and scooped up the unfortunate lad. In abject horror, Oliver's parents listened as he screamed, "They got me! Help, help! They've got me!" Everyone tried to place the direction from which these terrified cries were coming, and soon they realized that Oliver's voice was coming from above them. The minister raised the lantern as far as he could, attempting to cast some light into the pitch-black sky. It was no use. Oliver was nowhere to be seen, but his cries continued to drift down to them, tormenting his horrified parents as they gradually grew more and more faint. Eventually, they ceased altogether, leaving the Thomas family and their guests alone in the yard beneath the silent frozen sky. There were no other tracks in the snow, and no signs of a struggle of any kind. The water bucket Oliver had been carrying lay about 15 feet from where his footprints ended. The following day, police from Ryder appealed to local residents for help in locating the boy, and a search party was formed which examined the Thomases' well and then scoured the surrounding countryside. The Thomas family and their guests of the previous evening were closely questioned, but the only conclusion to which the police could come was that Oliver Thomas had been seized on his way to the well and was taken directly upwards. Although this conclusion was clearly not very satisfactory to the police, the physical evidence pointed strongly to it. But who or what could have done such a thing? No known animal could have done it without leaving tracks. Certainly no known bird could have carried off an 11-year-old boy. Neither could any known flying machine have done so in 1909. The only clue, and it is tenuous, is what Oliver himself cried as he was being taken up in the air. "They've got me. Not it, not something, but they." As American researcher Brad Steger states in his description of the case, this implies that Oliver got a good look at whoever had taken him. Oliver was never seen again. If he knew who or what his kidnappers were, he took the knowledge with him into the sky. And then the next segment is called Jumping Jelly Bags. Occasionally in the annals of ufology, one finds cases in which people have had narrow escapes from the kind of fate that perhaps befell the unfortunate Oliver Thomas. One such report was made in 1958 by two young Swedish men, Hans Gustafsson and Stig Ryberg, who claimed that they were attacked by incredibly bizarre creatures from a UFO. Although largely forgotten today, the event made headlines across Europe at the time and was reported in more than 70 newspapers. The strange tale began early in the morning of December 20th, 1958, as Gustafsson and Ryberg were driving from Höganäs to Helsingborg. At about 3 a.m., a thick mist descended over the highway, forcing them to slow their speed to less than 30 miles per hour. As they came to a wide clearing in the dense forest surrounding the highway, they saw an unusual light among the trees. Curious as to what was causing it, Gustafsson and Rydberg left their car and walked slowly and carefully into the mist that was shrouding both the highway and the forest. According to Hans Gustafsson, "We saw a strange disc. It was resting on legs about 2 feet long. It seemed to be made of a peculiar shimmering light that changed color. As the men gazed in shock at the object before them, they were confronted by several blobs. The men described them as like protozoa, just a bit darker, sort of a bluish color, hopping and jumping around the saucer like globes of animated jelly. Without warning, the creatures rushed at the men, enveloped them with their protoplasmic bodies, and began to pull them towards the UFO. The drag the things exerted was terrific, and they gave off such a terrible smell, like ether and burnt sausage," the men told investigators. According to Stig Ryberg, to try to resist the creatures was worse than useless. "It almost seems as if the creatures could read my mind. They parried every move before I made it. Their strength was not so great as the technique with which they wielded it." Perhaps this lack of strength was what allowed Rydberg ultimately to save himself and Gustafsson, for after struggling frantically with one of the protoplasmic creatures, he managed to wrench himself free and made a dash for the car. Two of the creatures began to chase him as he opened the driver's door and sounded the horn in an attempt to attract anybody's attention to their terrible plight. Meanwhile, Hans Gustafsson was losing his battle with the jelly creatures. He had grabbed hold of a fence post and was hanging on with all of his might as they stretched him out horizontally in their attempt to break his grip. As his hands started to weaken and he prepared to meet an unimaginable fate, the car horn blared out, shattering the early morning silence. This had an immediate effect on the dreadful blobs, which reacted as if in pain or fear and quickly retreated to their craft. With a piercing, high-pitched whistle, it rose into the air and shot away at a fantastic speed. Exhausted by their awful struggle, Gustafsson and Rydberg fell into the car and continued on their journey, vowing not to breathe a word of their experience to anyone for fear of the ridicule it would provoke. They would probably have remained silent had it not been for that terrible stench which clung to them, badly affecting their innards. Eventually, they began to fear for their health, and according to Gustafsson, we endured it for 3 days. Then we decided that we should see a physician. We were afraid that those monsters might have permanently damaged us in some way, perhaps internally. Although the doctor could find no physical injuries, the two men were haunted by the memory of what they had experienced, not to mention the hideous stench that still seemed to cling to them. Eventually, they decided to report their encounter and brace themselves for the adverse publicity. Gustafsson and Rydberg were questioned for 12 hours by representatives of the Swedish defense staff. Also present were doctors and psychologists who attempted to trick the men into contradicting each other. These attempts were unsuccessful. The testimonies were absolutely consistent with each other. The men then offered to take the defense officials and the press to the place where their nightmarish struggle had occurred. A large group went out to the forest clearing, and there they saw 3 indentations in the soil made by the UFO's tripod landing gear. After conducting several hypnosis sessions with the men, psychologists concluded that they genuinely believed what they were describing. They were not attempting to perpetrate a hoax. Outrageous as this case sounds, soon after the story broke, Danish officials came forward with a request to interview Gustafsson and Rydberg. Apparently, their own files contained a report made by a Danish woman who had described an almost identical encounter. On these 2 occasions, the jelly creatures thankfully failed in their attempt to carry off human beings. We might be forgiven for wondering how many times they have succeeded. And then that's it. That's everything associated with part 4 of chapter 4 of Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind. Once again, dealing with these abductions from the book UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that chapter here. First segment was death by unnatural causes. Interesting case. I think I might have talked about this one before. I'll have to check my videos again. But that notion of the guy being found on top of a cold tip, like his body being found there. I remember one of the comments, like somebody, like I had mentioned the question, like, what was that? And somebody had mentioned on it. It could be something else completely different, but I'll have to double check. But what a horrible way for this person, this poor guy, to basically go out. Whatever occurred to him, if it was on the UFO side, then clearly something happened to him. He got badly damaged during the abduction, and then he was unceremoniously just left on top of that cold tip just to be found later on. Horrible way to die, especially after those several days where he was just gone. He basically disappeared, and everyone was wondering what happened to him. A little bizarre, though, I thought about that phone call that came in afterward, claiming that instead what had occurred was he had been kidnapped for unknown reasons, and then because of it, something that he was doing, like he was trying to escape and then cause his own burns and eventual death, that those kidnappers panicked and then just dumped his body there. I don't know which angle really to believe, but at least that's something that I'll have to check again to see if I've talked about that before. The next segment, the one about the disappearing Eskimo village. Wow, that's interesting. That's really, really interesting stuff. I might have to feature that in a video soon. Imagine 1,200 villagers just gone, just outright gone. No trace of them being there. What happened to them? Nothing. And the poor dogs, too, the way they were found, too, just frozen solid, dying of starvation. Horrible way to go there. So I might have to talk about this sometime soon, too, to see more information on it, see what happened to it, because it's interesting. What truly caused these Eskimos to all leave as is. Leave doorways open, leave stuff on the tables, leave their guns right there too, leave the dogs just basically outside. No one knows to this very day, so it's definitely something to check out. Probably the most interesting story to me, though, was the one that was titled The Hungry Sky. There's something about those stories about people just outright disappearing. You've seen my playlist, The Mysteries and Disappearances, before, right? If you haven't, check out the videos. You'll see a theme on some of them where it's where 1 minute someone is there and then literally a couple seconds later they're not. And there's something about it that's just so arresting to me. The idea that you see someone walk around the corner, seconds later you cross that corner, and then they're gone. There's no way for them to have gone anywhere, but they're gone. And so here you have the case of this poor boy who went outside to get that bucket of water, and then lo and behold, out there in the middle of the snow in a field where there's no tracks, no indication of anybody that would have grabbed him, suddenly he's gone. And the last remnants are his voice being heard somewhere in the night sky, no pinpoint location as to where, saying that they've got him, and then the shock and horror of the parents hearing that until they can hear it no more. So it's something that I really want to talk about. So that'll probably be number one on there. And then the next one is jumping jelly bags. I think I have talked about this one before, about those blobs that were trying to get those two men. And it was interesting to see why they were trying to, like no reason known for it. And apparently there was that other case of the woman who these blobs were also trying to do as well. No indication as to that. I think I mentioned that before. I'll have to check my videos again too, but otherwise horrific way to think what would have happened to these guys if they would have been grabbed a hold of and then taken into the UFO. Just horrible stuff. But otherwise, again, that concludes everything. Chapter 4 of Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind. Let me know what your thoughts are with regards to this. And then next part, I'm going to start a whole new chapter here. It'll be interesting to see what that one talks about. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.